lecture in the 2005-2006 series. And we begin this year with a joint lecture, the Ignatian lecture, but also the joint St. Jerome's Waterloo Catholic District School Board lecture. And we're very pleased both with our excellent relationship with the Jesuits at the Ignatius Centre in Guelph and at Regis College at the University of Toronto, as well as the Waterloo Catholic District School Board. The Waterloo Catholic District School Board and St. Jerome's University have a formal partnership in Catholic education in this region, a partnership that now includes the fact that our president, Michael Higgins, sits on the Waterloo Catholic District School Board's trustees. We also tonight celebrate our partnership with the Eastern Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. We have several representatives of that church with us tonight. David Frimmer, who was recently installed as the Principal Dean of Waterloo Lutheran Seminary. And I can also see Phil Heinz, who essentially runs the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. Or at least that's what Bishop Michael Price tells me. We also have, because this is a Challenge for Change event, part of the Challenge for Change event, we also welcome people from the Social Affairs Committee of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Hamilton, Diane Baltaz, and from the Anglican United Church, the Presbyterian Church, and the Mennonite churches, as we open the 2005 Challenge for Change event. And so we welcome especially the participants of that event. If you haven't seen the literature, Challenge for Change is an ecumenical social justice education event that occurs once a year. The Reverend Dr. Stan McKay, who will be speaking tonight, will kick off that event tomorrow at St. Peter's Lutheran Church. If you wish to participate in that event, Carol Person has forms in the back where you can register, and you are more than warmly invited to join us. It promises to be a great event. There are, besides the brilliant opening talk, Treaty as Covenant by Dr. McKay, there will be workshops that will include Nathan Funk of Conrad Grable College, Ed Bianchi, Janet Somerville, who spoke here from this podium last year, and Scott Klein, who teaches with me in the Department of Religious Studies. The great events come out of great partnerships. Last year, in a partnership with Wordsworth Books, we had invited best-selling author John Kabat-Zinn, who spoke to an enormous audience here at St. Jerome's. He was discussing his new bestseller, Coming to Our Senses, and we used that to raise money for the Stephen Lewis Foundation, which provides funding to groups working with people who are HIV/AIDS affected in Africa. Every year, 2 million people in Africa die of HIV/AIDS related causes. And so it was a tremendously successful event. We raised over $7,700 for the Stephen Lewis Foundation in a single event. And just today, actually, I received a very warm letter of thank you from Mr. Lewis and his foundation. College, the Anglican College here at the University of Waterloo, and the Mexico Solidarity Network. Last June, we invited Don Samuel Ruiz, the Bishop Emeritus of Chiapas, Mexico, who spoke about the crisis of poverty and violence among Aboriginal people in Chiapas. And if you remember, Bishop Ruiz was nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize for his role as an official peace mediator between the Zapatistas and the Mexican government after the 1994 uprising. In that event, we also raised money for the Oscar Romero with the Peoples of Latin America, known also as the institute with the longest name in Latin America. We, again, just today, ironically, I received a warm letter of thanks from Bishop Ruiz, thanking us for making his stay in Canada so productive. So much for last year. This year, our theme is the amazing church. And the theme is stolen, quite frankly, from Gregory Baum's new book called Amazing Church. And in it, Baum reflects on the fact that despite the fact we have a conservative regime in the Roman Catholic Church today, what is quite amazing is that even a conservative pope today is light years, there's light years ahead, shall we say, of a progressive pope in the 1950s. And of course, that sea change was caused by or reflected in the Second Vatican Council. And I pointed out that in his first homily, Pope Benedict talked about the importance of ecumenism. Now, had Joseph Ratzinger, Father Joseph Ratzinger at the time in the 1950s, given a similar speech, it certainly, had he done this in 1955, it certainly would have spelled the end of his career, since at that time in the Vatican, ecumenism was seen as rather suspect. It was seen as a way of allowing Protestantism and the smoke of Satan to creep into the Church of Christ. The two were generally equated back then. So we see that, now we have a conservative pope, not a progressive pope, not a radical pope, but a conservative pope, declaring as official policy today what 40 years ago or 50 years ago would have been seen as heresy, would have been seen as near heresy. And this is the amazing church that this year's lecture series, this is the amazing change that this year's lecture series highlights and celebrates. Yes, much needs to be done, much more needs to be done to change the church, but we also have to stop and recognize that so much has changed and changed for the better. One of the greatest changes has been the church's attitude to non-Christian peoples, especially the Aboriginal peoples of the world. Again, very much, I want to emphasize, much work needs to be done, but the changes have been great. More and more, the churches have responded to the invitation of Leela Watson, an Australian Aboriginal woman who wrote, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up," more and more we see churches around the world, Christian churches around the world, adopting this attitude. I also noted that whether or not the churches have changed, the Aboriginal peoples of Canada and their attitudes have changed. And I took this from our guest speaker tonight, Stan McKay, in his book with Janet Silman, The First Nations, A Canadian Experience of the Gospel Cultural Encounter. And he's writing about the apology of the United Church in 1986 to Aboriginal peoples. And I quote, "Some of us had a deep fear about what it would mean if the church refused to make an apology. But I have an image that will always stay with me. One of the elders said, 'We will have the drum group come.' Then there was a discussion about that. Then someone said, 'What if the church doesn't apologize?' The elder's response was, 'Well, it doesn't matter. We have to dance whether they apologize or not.' That positive framework of being a people, no matter what the church did, was for me a moment of a statement of liberation." Tonight's guest, the Very Reverend Dr. Stan McKay, was born at Fisher River First Nation Reserve, a Cree community in northern Manitoba. He attended the Fisher River Indian Day School and the Bertel Indian Residential School. From there, he moved on to the Manitoba's Teachers College, where he received a teacher's certificate, and the University of Manitoba, where he received a Bachelor of Arts. He then received a Bachelor of Theology from the University of Winnipeg and was ordained in 1971 by the United Church of Canada. He spent 11 years in pastoral ministry at Norway House in Fisher River. He was the national coordinator of Native ministry for the United Church and director, and later co-director, of the Dr. Jessie Saulteaux Centre in Beausejour, Manitoba. He was Moderator of the United Church of Canada in 1992-94 and Director of the Spiritual Care Health Sciences Centre in Winnipeg from 1997 to 2000. Currently, he is advising First Nations on education, health, and development. His wife, Dorothy, who joins us tonight as a guest of St. Jerome's, and he have 3 grown children and are now living in Gladstone, Manitoba. And finally, I would be remiss if I did not mention he is the recipient of an honorary degree from the University of Waterloo, an initiative of St. Paul's College. And so welcome back to the University of Waterloo, and welcome to the St. Jerome Centre for Catholic Experience, Reverend Stan McKay.
It is a small world, after all. I just remembered as you were doing the background for the work here at St. Jerome's that in 1994 I was part of a delegation to Chiapas, international delegation, ecumenical, to look at what was happening in that area of the world at that time. And as we gather tonight, I'm very honored to be able to travel here with Dorothy and share in the tradition of this challenge for change. These conversations obviously happen throughout the lives of the people who are involved in this project, but we've driven from Manitoba, and Manitoba in our language means Manitoba is God's resting place. So we come from a good place, and we've arrived in a very good place. I do recall the experience of being at St. Paul's and being received and warmly hosted there. Well, St. Jerome's has a way of doing similar things, but I appreciated the sense of humor with which they did the welcoming and the warm hospitality that we've experienced. So thank you to the people who organize and work within the Challenge for Change concept. And I will tell you that I come with a deep hope in ecumenical development. I come with a deep inspiration about the possibility for change within the life of the body of Christ. But I also believe we have yet to really explore in Canada the interfaith concept of life shared on the good earth that we live upon here in this land. It was, I think, in June of 1991 that I was traveling on the road from the city of Winnipeg to Beauséjour. Driving down the road that evening, I came upon a water-filled ditch on the side of the road, which seemed to be full of some sort of moth or fly that came out onto the road as I drove by, and I could see them coming, clouds of them. And they covered my windshield on the car. And I turned on the windshield washer and attempted to make some space for me to see the road. Well, it took some work, and I'll come back to that. The Genesis story of creation is followed by, the stories are followed by chapter 3, which in one translation of the scriptures that I read is entitled The Fall of Man. Interesting title, especially in this time, in this place. The directions were, don't eat the fruit of the middle tree. The tree in the middle of the garden. Don't eat that fruit, lest you die. They ate it, their eyes were opened, and they saw their nakedness. Therefore, we have Walmart. Right? I want you to realize tonight how things escalate. It was a small thing in those years, but it's not away from us. Our history follows us. And tonight I'm hoping my wandering thoughts will allow you some hopeful reflection on what change might be like if we were to be responsible for the time in which we live and worry a little bit about the legacy that we will leave for those yet unborn. The most troublesome part of the third chapter of Genesis for me is the line that includes the phrase, "Cursed is the ground, said Lord God." This is a problem for Aboriginal peoples. But I think it's a problem for a society that lives as though everything in the world is dispensable. And we like to refer, in our reflections in Aboriginal community, to the lines in the first two creation. So I guess I'm inviting you to a journey into naivety and vulnerability and possibility. This morning on the news, it was reported that the Supreme Court of Canada, in deliberating the Blackwater case, which is from the Aboriginal community of British Columbia, but resulted from the situation in the Alberni Residential School, which was staffed by the United Church of Canada. The Supreme Court decided this week that government is not solely responsible for the sexual abuses committed in that school. The decision was that the government is 75% responsible as owners of the facility, but the United Church of Canada carries 25% of the accountability for any damages claimed as a result of that experience in that facility. I wanted you to ponder this tonight because I do know that this particular decision will have a significant impact on what we in Canada describe as the religious orders or the diocesan budgets of various parts of the church in Canada. And that it will impact not only on the United Church of Canada, but likely the Supreme Court decision will have impact on the Christian community in a much wider fashion. That is the background for some of our conversation, and is part of the background for what I think many of us experience in the church in these days, is that we're tired of talking about it. We're tired of hearing the stories of residential school, and we are no longer willing to endure that kind of storytelling. Well, now it would appear the courts have made a decision, and we have to get on with some kind of declaration about what relationship there will be between the First Peoples of Canada, those who were in residential schools, and the wider community within this land. This week, the Governor General has been in Manitoba. And yesterday, she was in Winnipeg speaking to the students and staff at the Aboriginal High School in Winnipeg. It's called Children of the Earth High School. And it was rated in the, I think, McLean's magazine recently as one of the top 10 high schools in Canada. And we have some small pride about that. Let me tell you what she said in part of her talk at that school yesterday. She was praising the staff and students of that facility for promoting Aboriginal traditions, experiences, and languages. She says this activity will enrich all Canadians. And she said to them, "You are models for us all." Now, if that is change, then I believe it. That is not the normal line within the histories of Canada. That phrase is not a recurring one, and so I believe she has set a precedent in terms of public speak about how Aboriginal culture, language, and experience will be viewed in this sacred land. In various parts of the country, little clips, forget what they call those vignettes, historic, they say. Well, somewhat historic. From one perspective, historic, or from two perspectives, historic, but often out of balance. Well, I haven't talked to my friends in this territory, but I must say now that I acknowledge I'm a visitor here. The Anishinaabe and the people of the Longhouse, the Mohawk people, Six Nations peoples in this territory, have been quoted as having said, Canada means village. Well, I've been pondering the word for a while. In our territory, Kanatan means sacred land. Kanatan. And so we would say the word may have more meaning than village, but I won't want to push that too hard because I am in the territory of the Longhouse peoples and respect very much their wisdom and their spiritual tradition. The report of the Supreme Court in Canada was reported today in the Toronto Star regarding the Gladue case of 1999. And this case is now being referenced by the Appeal Court of Ontario. And in today's paper, there is concern being expressed about the ongoing increase of representation of Aboriginal peoples in the institutions of incarceration across Canada. So Justice Robert Sharp of Ontario is calling for an assessment of the justice system's treatment of NCR accused. NCR, you say? Those are the not criminally responsible. And the sad part of the news story is that the justice system doesn't have the capacity to assess all the Aboriginal peoples who appear before the judges in the various courts of this land, of Canada. The article did indicate that in 1999, Aboriginal peoples, we made up 20% of the population in Canadian prisons. Today's newspaper says we are increasing in popularity. We are 22% of the prison population of this land. In actual numbers, we are less than 4% of the total population. So we live with history, and we live with the present, and we dream of the future. Creator God gives us that capacity to remember, to be relevant, and to dream. The early waves of Christian mission involved many, many instances where missionaries came with wonderful intentions. People of love and commitment of many denominations came to this land and gave their lives to the service of God in working with Indigenous. They came to do good. And in many, many cases, that has been proven over and over again. But what they described as good was about civilization, domestication, and in some ways extermination. So the process of love and goodness, we know from Canadian history, from an Aboriginal perspective, it's not enough to want to do good. So the education of the society and the determination that we can learn from our history, I think, is a wonderful opportunity. Mission is the concept of one culture with one truth. Indigenous peoples as empty vessels. And great dependence resulted from that experience for us as Indigenous people. But you know, there is something about growing up on a reservation that makes change very difficult. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not so good. But I grew up in a village knowing that my village was self-sufficient. On the shores of Lake Winnipeg on the west shore, we had access to the fisheries, to trapping and hunting. We grew small gardens. We had economic, social, and often our own health care, our own security system. But spiritually, we were a people being missioned to. But generally, as a child, I grew up believing we were a people, we had a language, and we lived as we had always lived, on the land. That ended with the legalization of education. The legalization of education. Interesting process in Canada. We became required by law to be in school for 10 months of the year. And our pattern of life on the land as families and as groups of families in various formations of organization, that all crumbled because we had to live now in one place. Our semi-nomadic life on the land ended. Then many of us went to residential school. Going back further in history, the strength of the French presence in Atlantic Canada, I am reading, was very much hinged on the loyalty of the Mi'kmaq people. And from 1680 to 1740, the missionaries became very effective because they recognized how central spirituality was in the lives of the people. And they traditionally knew that among Amerindians, as they described them, the most highly respected leaders were also shaman. So spirituality and leadership in the life of the community went together. And so the identification of this reality, of the centrality of religion and ceremony and culture, allowed the enlisting of these sentiments so that there would be a major factor in the French settlers living with an alliance with the Mi'kmaq people. Maillard, who wrote in 1748, only through religion could Amerindians be rendered docile, was his statement. And so religion was seen as a way of becoming allies of the Mi'kmaq people. In turn, in the subsequent wave, the British would adopt the French approach, using missionaries as agents to be a part of treaty negotiations and mediators in times of unrest. And this continued on the prairies into the middle of the 20th century. And in some ways, it has never ended. The role of the church was in this function. Well, I was saying, in 1991, I was driving my van down the road to Beausejour. You'll remember the bugs were on the windshield, and I was out trying to get them off. The water in the container was not getting them clear, and my old wipers just weren't working very well. So I was out there with a cloth trying to wipe these greasy marks off the windshield. Well, you know, the French, when they were in the Maritimes, decided that intermarriage was a good thing for relationships. So they provided dowries to the Amerindian, to the people who would marry Amerindian women. There were dowries given to French persons to marry Mi'kmaq people. Quite an extensive process that they developed. But many of the people who were there chose not to have a formal wedding. You know what I mean. So the idea of model villages happened. I don't know if you've ever heard of these, but they're very common in Methodist missionary areas. The idea was that if you could set up an ideal Aboriginal village, actually select people, put them together, and make a community. Well, in 1827, William Case established one near Belleville in Ontario here. It was initially on Grape Island, but then it was moved onto the mainland. In the Bay of Quinte is where it began, with about 200 Ojibwa people. To bring them together, he ran it like an army camp. Same thing happened in File Hill, Saskatchewan. There, an organizer of the model community took graduates from the residential school and brought them together and arranged marriages and brought a community of people together in this particular part just north of the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan. There was an even more extensive experiment with a Methodist or an Anglican leader who developed Metlakatla in 1862. William Duncan worked just north of Port Simpson on the west coast. And he was a schoolmaster, but he thought that the best thing would be to form a model village and bring Aboriginal people together in this process and create something productive out of Aboriginal community. I guess what I'm painting is really a pretty clear picture of how mission has been a part of the history and how the church has been intricately involved in the Europeanization of First Peoples. I'm going to stop this process and just say to you that the issues that were there in first contact in the 17th century between settlers and First Nations, the same issues that were there in the 18th century, 19th, 20th centuries are with us now. I believe the churches and people of faith, people of law who long for justice, still have to address the same issues. We either address the unjust issues of the colonization process, or we try to help First Peoples accept the way things are. We have a choice. And so if those are the choices we have, there are others with different degrees of latitude. But I think that's primarily what we have in 2005. The challenge for change is, do we continue the process of helping people adjust to 22% incarceration in prison, or do we find another way to help our children, your children, my children, be together on the earth in good ways? And I know that's a major challenge because I've been about the business of trying to build bridges for a few years, but I'm becoming very impatient. Dorothy and I have a grandson. He's soon going to be 4. And he's trying to understand the world. About 3 weeks ago, we were out sitting by a fire in our yard. He was visiting Manitoba than here, it's colder. We were watching, and there were a couple flocks of birds, some small ones, and then some geese flying in formation over our heads south. And I said, Noah, these birds are going south to be warm so they can come back another time. I gather here on campus the geese don't all leave. I noticed they've been here. I was walking around the campus. Didn't see the geese, but knew they were here. But as we were watching these birds fly over, suddenly in the other direction came this seagull, Jonathan, I think, going north. And our grandson said, "Oh no, it's going north, it's going to get cold." He was worried about the bird. I think that's how detailed our understanding needs to be. We have to get some kind of process of allowing the understanding of some people flying in a different pattern. And this seagull is an example of how you might fly. I've just had the privilege of sitting for a couple of days in Montreal with people from Kahnawake and Kanesatake. And there are a handful of people there who are taking the scriptures and putting them into their language. They're taking the scriptures and putting them into the languages of their community, the language of their community. And their story is remarkable, hopeful and promising. They've determined, first of all, which books they're going to start with. And they determined they're going to start with 2 Corinthians at one point. 2 Corinthians. And the advisors from the Canadian Bible Society, the specialists, the consultants said, well, I wouldn't start there. That's a very difficult area to work with in terms of concept and the flow of the language. You know what the problem became? The Mohawk had too many words for the concepts. They had to begin to remove some of the words they were putting down because it was becoming multi-level of meaning within their translation. So they are convinced, and I'm convinced, and I believe the advisors to the project are convinced as well, that they are arriving from the Hebrew scriptures into an expression of the gospel, an expression of the epistles, and the prophetic word of the Hebrew scriptures that is closer to the translation of the original story than much of what we call modern English. They are working in scholarly fashion with very intricate concepts, and they're also bringing in the depth of the Mohawk experience to the Word of God. As I say, I was honored to be there because I believe there is something happening among us that has great hope and great promise. But we need to be about the acknowledgement and appreciation of our differences and our potential for meeting in the middle. The balance of life. Dot and I have visited a number of times an area in the Whiteshell in eastern Manitoba, southeastern, on the Canadian Shield, and on some large bare rock in the Whiteshell area, there are 3 or 4 areas of petroforms. And if any of you have ever visited areas where First Peoples have put out rocks in an order, in a pattern, and made symbols and signs and told stories in the placement of rock. Well, many things there are impressive. There's much to see. But the one that I still remember many days of my life is a elongated rock on this Canadian Shield with some appendages on it, and it's balanced. If you touch that, it begins to move. It begins to move. And that, for me, symbolizes the tenderness of relationship in life. And that life is really about discovering how we impact each other in our living and in our journey. Conventional wisdom is no longer adequate. I believe we need to be about the rediscovery of our original instructions. When I was at St. Paul's a few years ago, I remind the gathering there that Arthur Solomon, an Anishinaabe elder, who is now with the Great Spirit, He used to say, when everyone is born in the world, when everyone is born, when they come into the world, they are given their original instructions. They are complete human beings. And the old people in my village used to come and visit when a baby was born, and the midwives would have done their work, and they'd say, ikwe, or nape, this is a man, or this is a woman here. This is a person, and our village has hope. So here we are, 2005, in the autumn of the year, and babies are being born, and young ones are waiting for stories. And here we have many wise people with experience and wisdom and commitment to community. We can be about change and new understanding. Thanks be to God. Kanatiso kise manitu. That we have a time to ponder, and those who plan events like the Challenge for Change on this campus are at work. And I hear small hints on this campus that there may be small changes made to welcome Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal peoples onto campus. And somewhere in the life of this community, the voices and the presence of First Peoples might also enrich this challenge, this growth of understanding. May we be given what we need for the change that is ours. I thank you all.
Stan has agreed to take some questions. If you will indicate your interest in asking a question by raising your hand, and Ivan Person will bring a microphone to you.
The bugs on the headlights. I have to just finish that, right? I'm getting a bit old, really. I was going to tell you that the real problem was that I got the windshield clean, and I started to drive, and I couldn't see the road. My headlights were covered with bugs. And I think that's where the church is in many ways. We've cleared the windshield. We see many things. But the source of light may not be coming through.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit when you were saying that we're at a crossroads of deciding, do we kind of undo colonialism for the Aboriginal people or just help them adapt? Is there any possibility that we can just sort of undo it?
The process of undoing often begins with a willingness to journey together. I believe the opportunity for reconciliation and understanding to be developed is there for us. But I think the agenda has to be set jointly between the various peoples. And now we have many, many cultures in Canada. It's not just about First Peoples. I think it's about the global diversity. So I hope the agenda will be focused on some of the issues of our historic relationship, and our children will grow up knowing there's some work to be done there. But I also think, yes, there are things to be done now, because we cannot stand in the midst of the historic oppression and the legacy of dependency and injustice that has been laid foundationally in the history of the country. I think we have to stand with those who were in mission 200 years ago, who came with love and devotion, but we also will come now with a deep understanding that moves the heart. And that balance is what I think we long for. There is no instant solution. There are many First Nations peoples across the land of different languages and cultures. But generally speaking, I think in every region of the world, there's opportunity for healing and growth together. And I'd like us to experiment within our own regions and territories.
Stan, you said that there were so many Aboriginal people in jail, but I think we have already learned a lesson that the people need a community to make the people better, and I think that came originally from the Aboriginal people. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about why the people are in jail, or maybe even more how we can help the people, everywhere without going to jail?
Well, again, a very complex and important question. My own experience coming out of residential school when I did in the around 1959, 60, when I came out of residential school, many of the fellows my age moved almost directly from the residential school into the jail. We were made so dependent there, it was like being incarcerated. So I think the patterning, although the residential schools have closed, the patterns of dependency have been maintained. I'm part of a child and family project in Manitoba where we're beginning to work with caring for our own children as Aboriginal peoples. We have our own agencies now in the province, and we're beginning to develop files and do prevention work rather than breaking families up, to bring them counseling and support as extended families. So I think various approaches can be taken, but much of it starts with children and youth and those visioning for those yet unborn. For those of us who have lived for a time in this society, I do think we need to address the way in which our incarceration happens and how skewed the system is. And I think acknowledge the fact that we do live with racism in the society. If we can see that institutional problem and begin to work with it, I think we can make small change. But my hope has always been, as I become more accountable as a grandfather, hopefully, then I think I will see that the little children are the ones who have the wisdom to adapt and live together with dignity and respect. And much of it is about poverty and making us dependent on social assistance. I think we have to deal with a social safety net. It's a net, and it encapsulates many people in the society who are poor and marginalized. Yes, we have to take responsibility as well. Don't let me forget that as First Nations people, we have to be in our own areas, working at new ways of being people and coming out of this long history of colonization. We do need to do a better job. We have been divided and conquered, and some of us in our leadership style, we seem to love division. It's a government approach, but we've accepted it, and I think we can move beyond that. I think people like George Erasmus, who was a chief of Assembly of First Nations, worked long and hard to try to develop some collaboration. But as First Peoples, we do need to be more inclusive as well. We are called Indians under the Indian Act, but there are Métis and Inuit and people not in status. We should all be working together. This is much too large an issue for this fragmentation. So it's long and hard, and I think it's possible, but much of it will be left to our children to carry forward as we offer wisdom about the opportunity.
I loved your analogy of the car with the clear windshield but the blocked headlights. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more specifically about what's blocking the headlights.
There's a book called Canada's First Nations by Olive Patricia Dickinson. I think there's much about the clouded vision. I believe that much of the struggle of mission globally has been about headlights that are dimmed by cultural limitation. So I think interfaith, interchurch work has been much a factor in our divisions within the country and within the reservation. But also, the source of light is really a call to walk faithfully without all the encumbrance of our security and safety nets. So I think the headlight, to my mind, is the image of a truth given to us. All of us have original instructions, but we have to bring those together. So the headlight, in my mind, goes against the Declaration of Human Rights as individualistic rights. The headlights are about our shared life, that we learn about where the light is leading us as peoples, as many families, diverse. And I think those are the kinds of, I guess, Jesus teachings. That's how I would describe them. The stories are about the headlights, not about the windshield. We're not asked to see into the future as much as to walk day by day in the light we are given. And Aboriginal philosophy is very, very much about living for this time and praying with thanksgiving for this day, and not always worrying about what's going to happen next week or next month. So I don't think that's all the truth, but I think there are many truths that are different than our own that'll help us see each other and appreciate that diversity is gift, and it's not to be feared.
There's either the woman in the... I should mention that Chuck Arian of Wordsworth Books has signaled to me that this book, Canada's First Nation, he actually has at the back of the room, as well as a series of other books.
I've just arrived back from Iqaluit, Nunavut, having worked there for 2 years with the Inuit as a registered nurse. I have two questions. First of all is specifically my noticing and my embarrassment personally as a person of faith, the rise of fundamental Christianity in the North. The second issue is, and it's, I guess it's talking about the colonization, and do we just say, look, live with it, you have to get involved with the Canadian reality, but the second issue is seeing the Inuit change because of the global warming and the issue of the environment. Could you make comments on those two things that I continue to be grieving about? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That was going to be my next hour's discussion. I have tried to stay away from that because what you have described for me in Iqaluit is the second and third wave of mission. It's the recurring refrain of you are poor and suffering and marginalized because you are sinful. And if your relationship with the Creator God was to be made right, you would be given a place in heaven. So the denial of accountability on the earth is another way that religion becomes used for maintaining status quo. And the most tragic piece, of course, is many of the evangelists in my territory in Manitoba are my cousins. The recruited people now are from among us who believe that the gospel says that we must give up all of our language and traditions and ceremony in order to become Christian. And so the second, third, fourth waves of mission are really breaking us apart in ways that are hard to comprehend. And part of the struggle, I think, in Iqaluit and in other places, I understand it, is that the historic missioning churches have withdrawn some of their energy. It's no longer romantic to go into Pikangikum, Ontario, where there's a suicide every week among the young people. It's no longer romantic for our denomination to commit money to that particular community to provide pastoral care and support. It used to be, but it isn't anymore. So I think the Iqaluit experience is being repeated across the land. There's much confusion because at the same time, there are many young people going back to the traditional ways of prayer and ceremony. There are many sitting by the sacred fire, many going to the longhouse, many going to places of prayer that are of the traditional way, because they find in the churches nothing that is healing and holistic. And I think we have a serious challenge there, but what the answer to all of that is, because you see, many of the fundamental churches come into our villages and they do help curtail alcoholism and drug abuse by convincing people they should live in a Christian way. So they do some things, but at the same time they are feeding the confusing message that we cannot do anything over our cultural capacity, and our understanding must take us to another cultural place. So heaven help us all. We are in need of some clarity about what it is to be faithful to God, and for those of us who are Christian, what it means to be followers of the Christ. As women and men, what is our function? So that lack of clarity, I think, is true. And I too grieve the confusion and the hostility within our villages because the Christian message has brought confusion and division.
We have two questioners, one here and the next one.
In turn to the divisiveness of you raised over here, there's a story well known that the Mohawk and the Cree up in the Moose in the area of Fort Albion were working together, but the fun that arose was the massacre that had occurred many decades ago. Now, when you think of the vulnerability to divisiveness imposed on you, it's quite remarkable the goodwill that has been achieved. And I just wondered, could you expand a little bit more on how your kind of demonstrated goodwill, where you picked up the extraordinary story of working with the Six Nations people and the Kinestawi people down in Montreal, and you referred to their your great respect, and for different clans and peoples.
Well, just in response, a brief story about a visit to Six Nations, and it really should have been a response to the earlier question. I remember visiting there, a group of us from the church community, the United Church of Canada community, went to visit Six Nations. And we were hosted by a panel of people. There were people from the Anglican Church, the United Church, representative from the Longhouse, someone from an evangelical church. These were all people from the community. And they spoke in turn. And it was by coincidence, I think, the evangelical Christian person was sitting beside the person from the Longhouse. And he spoke first about the work of the evangelical church and how they were very different from the Longhouse, because the Longhouse needed to do some work on its theology or its approach. And he finished his presentation about his work, and the person from the Longhouse, a very big man, stood up and he said, "What my brother says is true. In the Longhouse, we are working with the young people to encourage them to walk the road of peace in a good way." He taught me something that I didn't know was possible in discussing religion and concepts of truth, about the respect and the quality of humility that can be carried within our faith and within our life on the good earth. So I think, there are many stories like that. I'm sure there's stories within your traditions, within your families, about the grace and gentle nature of people of faith. And I've experienced that, and as I say, I see it in Six Nations. I see it among the people translating the scriptures. At one point, one community had one word for a particular concept in their translation, and their neighbors across the river in Montreal, in Kahnawake, had a different word. So they had a long discussion, and they agreed they would use one word in the translation, but they would put a footnote in and add the other word below so people could cross-reference depending on which community they came from. That, I think, is the nature of goodwill and the potential for healing and respect that I've witnessed in many places.
I guess as we move into the future, much of Canada moves forward by way of technology, and it seems almost to be an impasse to reconcile that world with and still maintain the history and traditions of Indigenous peoples who want to also move forward. So I guess my question is how to go about bringing those two together without further causing harm to the Indigenous people's traditions.
The Anishinaabe have 7 words about 7 teachings. And of the 7, I've only taken one that I've been trying to work on, and that's the teaching of respect. And I think it's an important one in your question, because I think at some point within North American context, we have to give up on the idea of cloning everyone, making everyone the same, which often is a part of the classroom experience. So I don't know the answer to your question other than to say I believe it can be possible to accept the values and the teachings of the traditional ways of the peoples and continuing to function in the society in peace. The Two-Row Wampum Treaty, historic treaty of the Two-Row Wampum, which was about traveling the road of life in respect, in dignity, in communication, but separate roads, I believe was a wise and insightful approach of the Mohawk people with the Dutch settlers so many years ago. How far we can move, I'm not sure. I too am struggling. We have a son who is very much into computer technology, and there's so much linear thought going on. Communication is so linear, and in the storytelling of our people, it's circular. Life is changing, and the spirit of the story is alive, and so on. So it's difficult to know the future of our relationships. But I believe what the Governor General has said. The work of the children, the young people at Children of the Earth High School in the inner city of Winnipeg can be a gift to the society. That I'm foolish enough to believe that Indigenous peoples globally have something to offer to the societies in which they exist. And if we have capacity to live together in a good way, that all of us can benefit. So I naively and I think we need to talk more about how that could be. I want to drink, in closing, some water. Today in Saskatchewan, they don't have any. Someone who engineered their water system put the septic system upriver and the water system downriver. And one of the major issues in this land and in the world is the quality of water available to the poor peoples of the world, because it then affects the whole health of society. I honor the people of Saskatchewan, and I honor you for this gift of water. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stan, for this wonderful dialogue, a presentation that was moving enough, but the dialogue and the respect that you were talking about is so obvious in your approach to people's questions, and we're very grateful for that. I want to make a few announcements, and then I'm going to ask Michael Higgins, the president of St. Jerome's University, to come up and thank you more formally. First, I want to announce again that the Challenge for Change registration information is available at the back. Stan McKay will kick off that with a talk called Treaty as Covenant. The theme is Treaty as Covenant in Search of Right Relations. And there will be a series of workshops throughout the day, and of course Stan McKay's keynote address. I want to thank you also for this great presentation and a fine sense of humor. I met Stan at a gathering of academics, and he once recounted how he opened a United Church, or he was asked to close a United Church gathering with a prayer. And of course, every Protestants, as soon as you say, let's pray, they all bend their heads and close their eyes. Catholics never do that. And you can always tell ecumenical gatherings, as soon as they say, let us pray, all the Catholics are doing this, all the Protestants are doing that. And as soon as a piece of bread leaves the table, all the Catholics are doing this, and the Protestants are going, why is he doing that? So, but Stan's observation was that people, of course, immediately did this. He said, no, lift your heads and open your eyes. He says, Aboriginal people pray with their eyes open because the last time we prayed with our eyes closed, when we opened them, the land was gone. Anyway, I should get on with my announcements. One of them is there's an art exhibit here at St. Jerome's University that Michael Higgins is going to talk about when he comes up. It was funny because I tried to, give a nice warm welcome to our guests and show them our new art exhibit, our new art gallery, and they moved the door of the art gallery. I tried to get in from the inside. They moved the door, and our guests must have thought, first of all, I was mad because I kept talking about this non-existent art gallery, and I couldn't find the door to it, even though I work here. And secondly, I just about made it worse by telling them that it was wonderful to have visitors from the prairies here to see this exhibit by an artist named Bilson, except I had misread the poster and I said, you're going to love it. There's an art exhibit of bisons. And I thought, they're going to love these portraits of buffaloes in various stages. Anyway, so there are opportunities for misunderstanding, even with the best of intentions. And the last I was going to talk about was the attempt in Kanas Bible. It reminds me of a story where, because of the relationship between Scotland and England during the so-called Union, the Scots were not allowed to translate the Bible. It had to be done in the King James Version. It had to be read in the King James Versions. And so in the 1970s, Scottish people who spoke Scots Gaelic and wanted to revive the language, translated the New Testament into Scots Gaelic. And it was a wonderful translation. Everyone admits, masterful, artistic, except for one thing. The whole thing's in Scots Gaelic, but Satan still speaks the King's English. It's true. So I don't know if you want to take this wisdom back to Kanasatake and Ganakwe. Anyway, I just want to point out a couple of things in the back. Carol Person and her husband, Ivan, who volunteers. Ivan teaches at Resurrection High School. Carol works here at St. Jerome's. They do a wonderful job of welcoming us at the back. There is a table where you can sign up for email notifications of future lectures in this series. There is a table where you can sign your name and put your address down. We will mail you the brochure over the summer. The St. Jerome's Catholic community has a table there where you can get fairly traded coffee and chocolate and tea for sale. As well, Carol Person sells tapes of the lectures. We tape all the lectures of the year, and you can purchase these tapes back there at our cost. As well, I just want to make sure I get everything here. There's a sign that last year we started a tradition of accepting or asking people for free will offerings. The St. Jerome's Centre was established with a donation from a variety of institutions in 1982 with money that was supposed to last 5 years. The money actually lasted 20 years. But now we do ask for some support from the people who enjoy these lectures and want other people to continue enjoying them. So we started that tradition last year, and if you could be generous, there is a basket on Carol Person's table there, and she would gratefully accept those donations. Finally, Chuck Arian from Woodsworth Books is set up in the back. He has a series of books all related to tonight's topics, and I strongly urge you to look them over. And with that, I will introduce Michael Higgins, but before I do, I want to announce the next lecture, which happens to be by Dr. Michael Higgins, 2006 Somerville Lecture in Christianity and Communications. The title is Stalking the Holy in Pursuit of Saint-Making. Most people think with Michael's case it should be in pursuit of sainthood, but in fact the title is In Pursuit of Saint-Making, and that will be on Friday, November the 4th, 2005. Actually, I said that joke once already. I'll use it again, that Michael was turned down from sainthood because you need 3 miracles to become a saint in the Catholic Church, and it turned out 2 of his were card tricks. And it's true. This actually happened. And in the 3rd case, he claimed to have cured a ham. People don't believe that story, but I swear it's true. I should also welcome the students from St. Jerome's who who joined us tonight. My own class is here, Religion in Canada class, and we just did a section on the residential school system, and so your contribution was very much appreciated by our students too. So thank you for that as well. And now, without further ado, please help me welcome St. Michael Higgins.
According to law, only 2 miracles for canonization. One of them I hope to meet by eliminating David. David referred earlier in his more intelligible mode to the art gallery exhibition that we have called The Chronicles of Bilson. Not The Chronicles of Bolson, which you've been listening to, but Bilson is a remarkable figure, and we do encourage you, if you have the time over the weekend, we have opened this new exhibition of this work. This is our own work that we have in our collection here, given to us by 2 remarkable donors, simply because it is a wonderful opportunity to see a major figure on the international artistic landscape. They're very lush, very peculiar, and wonderful pictures, and please take an opportunity to go to the art gallery. It is open this weekend, and it is absolutely free. The role of the St. Jerome Centre for Catholic Experience and the Institute for Studies in Theological Renewal in helping to establish an environment or an arena in which understanding with the First Nation peoples of this country has been an important part of its platform can be seen in the fact that many years ago we had the chief of the Grassy Narrows Reserve here. And we also came here and spoke very powerfully about the role of Christianity, both in a positive sense and in a negative sense, in terms of evangelization with the native peoples of Canada. Tonight is a continuation of that very important tradition here at St. Jerome's by welcoming the Reverend Dr. Stan McKay, who spoke to us very powerfully about the centrality of multi-faith dialogue in his own life and in that of the church that he at one time led. He outlined very briefly of the importance of remembering, of the importance of relevance, and indeed of his memory. But it is also pain and grace. It is opportunity. And everything in the end falls into that wonderful capacity that we understand so well about Aboriginal wisdom, the very balance of life itself. That's why I was particularly struck about the meaning of the word Canada. For some it is the sacred land, for others it is village. But in all, the Aboriginal philosophy is about gratitude, about living in the now, and about diversity as a gift. These are extraordinary features or characteristics of the Canadian reality, and how often we forget they are at the very heart of the Aboriginal gift. Throughout tonight's address, Stan reminded us, I think, again and again, of the importance of establishing a tone of respect, of humility, of recognizing the grace and gentle nature of people of all faith, and that how, in an important way, this is an antidote to the despair and to the fractiousness and to the confusion, incomprehension, and sometimes terrible animosity that defines religious life in this country. So thank you, Stan, for helping us tonight, all of us, clean our collective and individual windshields, if only for a while. Thank you.
And with that, it's simply for me to thank you for participating in this event. For those from Challenge for Change, the event continues tomorrow morning at St. Peter's Lutheran Church. We look forward to seeing as many of you there as we can. And thank you again for your lively participation in this debate. It's always wonderful. Your support is always greatly appreciated. So thank you very much.